Welcome back, folks, to our lecture now, Indo-European Migrations, the Eastern Mediterranean during the Bronze Age, 2000 to 1000 BCE. This is the lecture that follows on our Unit 1 material, which you'll recall ended with the first civilizations, that first wave of civilizations beginning in Mesopotamia and the Nile River Valley of Egypt, and then accompanied by other sites globally. We talked about civilization as being the third great globalization. This period now, what we sometimes call the Bronze Age, from roughly 2000 to 1000 BCE, is what we might imagine as the next wave of civilization, and it is specific to the region of the Eastern Mediterranean, basically bounded by Egypt to the south, and as we'll see, Anatolia and the Hittite Empire to the north. So we're focusing on a specific global region here, the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East, to look at the various goings on in what we'll call the second wave now of civilization. In particular, we're going to look at this idea of a language migration, the Indo-European language migrations, to see how historians use language, among other things, as a way to track history. And we begin today with bronze-shod horses. Bronze-shod horses. This is a scene, a 5th century illuminated manuscript depicting a battle scene from the famous epic poem known as the Iliad, by the Greek poet Homer. We're going to be talking a bit about the Iliad here, but you get a sense from this depiction of it that it involved great warriors wielding bronze weapons, swords, shields, body armor, and the like in epic battles that come to make up the famous Iliad. Taking an excerpt from Homer's Iliad, "Now dawn the yellow-robed, scattered all over the earth. Zeus, who joys in the thunder, made an assembly of all the immortals upon the highest peak of rugged Olympus. There he spoke to them himself, and the other divinities listened. He spoke, and under the chariot harnessed his bronze-shod horses, flying-footed, with long manes streaming of gold, and he put on clothing of gold about his own body, and took up the golden lash, carefully compacted, and climbed up into his chariot, and whipped them into a run, and they winged their way unreluctant through the space between and the starry heaven." Lovely poetry here when you say we have the chief deity of the Greek pantheon, Zeus, getting his battle gear on, climbing into his chariot, pulled by his bronze-shod horses, his golden lash. I mean, the imagery here is replete with gold and iron, and or bronze, I should say, and thunder. There the Father of gods and of mortals halted his horses and slipped them from their harness and drifted close mist about them, and himself, rejoicing in the pride of his strength, sat down on the mountain looking out over the city of Troy and the ships of the Achaeans. And so here we are introduced to the scene that Zeus has come to witness, a great battle between the city of Troy and their enemies, the Achaeans. And the Achaeans are those who we conventionally refer to as the Greeks. So you have to think back to the map quiz where you were basically designating sites around the Aegean Sea. The Achaeans or Greeks are coming from the western part of the Aegean, what we'll call the Greek mainland, sailing their ships across the sea to confront on the eastern side their rivals, the Trojan people of the city of Troy. Now, as these advancing came to one place and encountered, they dashed their shields together, and their spears, and the strength of armored men in bronze, and the shields massive in the middle, clashed against each other, and the sound grew huge of the fighting. There the screaming and the shouts of triumph rose up together, of men killing and men killed, and the ground ran blood. So very dramatic, very intense is the fighting scene of these bronze shielded spearmen and swordsmen fighting in a great contest now, witnessed by Zeus himself, who is flown in especially with his magic chariot and horses to take the whole scene in. All right, so this makes up then the substance of the poem, the great Greek epic poem we know as the Iliad, and its reputed author, Homer, said to be a 7th century BCE author of not only the Iliad but its famous companion, the Odyssey. Here, Homer depicted later in a Roman statue. We have to pay attention to chronology, and if we do our job, if we keep track of the time periods, that's something that history students always want to do, right? Do we have to know dates? Well, yeah, we do, because it won't make sense unless we pay attention now to chronology. The scenes depicted by Homer in the Iliad go back to the Bronze Age, as we said, the period between 2000 and 1000 BCE. He himself, as a living figure, only lived later in the 7th century BCE, so some 400 years after the Bronze Age ended, and at least that long, but actually longer, after the scenes that he described of warfare between the Greeks and the Trojans. So we have two separate time frames immediately to grasp, that of the Bronze Age, where the action took place, and the later age of Homer, in which he was in effect telling the story that was already by his time rather old, if not ancient. And then our own time, of course. Living as we do in the 21st century, we are now nearly 3,000 years, a good 2,500 plus years anyway, removed from Homer himself. So a third time frame to deal with here. And the question from our own time is, could it be true? Certainly the stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey were long thought to be purely myth. The stories of the Iliad, however, will be rediscovered and reimagined as something other than mythology. And here's where it gets weird, folks. The man who rediscovers a historical quality to the events described in the Iliad is none other than a former banker from Sacramento. Let's see. Yeah, in the 1870s, it was a German-born archaeologist by hobby. There really was no professional archaeology in those days. An amateur archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann, who'd made a fortune in the California gold rush, thus living in Sacramento, took his dog-eared copy of Homer's Iliad. The thing that was his great passion was the study of this ancient Greek poetry. And he'd made enough money in the gold rush to fund an expedition carrying his own copy of Homer's Iliad to Turkey, what is now modern-day Turkey, what we refer to typically as Anatolia, because yet another time frame intervenes. Turkey doesn't become Turkey until, the 15th century. So long before the 15th century, in the age of Homer, and the age Homer describes even older, the region the Greeks called Anatolia, where he, Heinrich Schliemann, the modern discoverer, think of him as a kind of Indiana Jones character, will begin to follow the description of Homer's Iliad to find what he believes are the actual historical ruins from the Bronze Age that he claimed belonged to the Trojan War, just as described in the Iliad. All right, so we get a guy in the 19th century, made a ton of money in the gold rush. His real passion is the study of ancient poetry, including Homeric poetry. He believes it's more than mythology. He thinks that it was an actual event, this Trojan War, described later by Homer, and he set out to discover it. Travels to Turkey, hires up a crew of diggers and excavators, and sure enough, among the ruins he located were those in Hisarlik, Turkey, the modern day Hisarlik, Turkey, near the Aegean coast. Let's get the map up, or the scene rather, of the ruins, which he claimed were the famous walls of Troy described by Homer. He also claimed to find the golden diadem, that is, the elaborate necklace piece described as being worn by Helen of Troy, the woman whose beauty began this whole conflict. And he had his wife here, Heinrich Schliemann had his wife pose wearing these really dazzling jeweled ornaments found in the excavation of Hisarlik, Turkey. He claimed them to be the actual golden diadem worn and described by Homer, worn by Helen of Troy in the Iliad. So who can blame him for being excited? You know, he had to go against all the doubters to begin with, to find these ruins, to dig them out, to find buried treasure that seemed to correspond to the descriptions of the epic itself, and just for good measure having his wife now photographed as if Helen of Troy herself was now back from mythology. And as we look at the picture here, the modern picture of the ruins of Hisarlik that Schliemann's team excavated, you can almost not blame them for wanting to say that these were the walls, the original walls of Troy that the Greeks had confronted, the famous walls of history from Homer's Iliad. Well, it's not that I don't love a good story. I think either way it's a good story, but as it turns out, what Schliemann found was not a single city. Certainly not the single city of Troy made famous in the mythology of Homer, but instead what he had uncovered were several ancient cities built one on top of the other over time, and some of them, yes, dating back to the Bronze Age. Schliemann's ruins proved that cities around the Aegean Sea thrived during the period described by Homer, a period historians sometimes call the Bronze Age. We'll expand that period a bit back to 2500 BCE down to 1000 BCE, and it was within that period of time then that the ruins Schliemann found had originally been constructed. And there's our map of the Aegean Sea with the relevant areas labeled. If we look here at Troy, we see it over on the eastern side, what is usually considered geographically to be the Asian side of this landmass. Troy sitting here at the straits now that come down from the Black Sea. Troy will be, I suppose you could say, ideally located to gain revenue from the Bronze Age trade that had all kinds of commodities being brought down from the Black Sea region here, including wheat and grain and other valuable mineral commodities brought through the straits here into the Aegean Sea, where nature had formed, geography had formed a kind of natural circuit of trade, with the island of Crete here in the south, the Anatolian seacoast or Ionian seacoast here to the east, the Greek city-states in the west, including on the mainland here where we see Athens, ideally located to have access to these trade routes. The Peloponnese, which included Greek city-states like Corinth and Sparta, and for our purposes, the one here, Mycenae, is the one that Heinrich Schliemann will claim was the home of the Achaeans, of King Agamemnon and the soldiers who sailed to Troy to fight in the Trojan War. So, yeah, keep that in mind. Mycenae being one of the key city-states. It was said that the ancient Greek philosopher Plato described the Aegean Sea as like a lily pond, and all the peoples and city-states and ports centered around the lily pond, sometimes on these islands here, these Greek isles, like frogs on a pond. So that was Plato's description of the Aegean. But truly, what we know, and we'll talk more about this, is that it is one of the great Bronze Age trading circuits. That is, the wealth of trade and commerce and exchange from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, from the Mediterranean, we'll see, to the Nile River Valley of Egypt, form one of the first great trading circuits of the Bronze Age, and became the stuff of legends, as it turns out, to later generations like that of Homer, who liked to recall what they considered to be an age of heroes. So yeah, the map, Troy, its ideal location to handle much of the trade that passed from the Black Sea to the Aegean Sea, and likely became rich as a city, rich enough even to build great stone walls and streets and palaces and other refinements of urban life, later remembered by the poets of Homer's day. Convinced that he had found Troy, our modern Indiana Jones, that is Heinrich Schliemann, traveled to Greece looking for the home of King Agamemnon. And guess what? He found it, or at least he thought he did, in the ruins of a city-state long buried called Mycenae. And why not? Again, who can blame Schliemann? So far, he was on a winning streak, finding what he set out to find from the pages of Homer's Iliad, the ancient tales of that great conflict, now locating what he called the home base of the Achaeans, or Greeks, who, under the leadership of King Agamemnon, famously confronted their rivals at the city and gates of Troy. But they had their own city gates back on the mainland. What comes to be called the Lion's Gate is one of the great features that Schliemann will uncover. That is, the ancient ruins made of these enormous stones, long been covered over by dust and dirt and neglect, no longer inhabited. Schliemann and his crew of excavators and diggers and rock carriers and rock brushers and others will begin to peel off those layers of time and find some very great ruins indeed. None more exciting here than this gold gilded mask, burial mask, found in one of the burial pits of Mycenae by Schliemann's team. He claimed, as he said, when he first saw it, to have gazed upon the face of Agamemnon. Well, again, can't blame the man for his enthusiasm. As it turns out, it wasn't Agamemnon, but it was an elite from the Bronze Age whose own burial signified his great status in life and the wealth of this trading city. Wealthy enough to build a Lion's Gate entrance, wealthy enough to have a gold-plated death mask, but not King Agamemnon, alas, and I'll talk to you about why that's the case. King Agamemnon was a figure of mythology, and as we have understood now, mythology is its own form of storytelling that depends typically on things like supernatural events. Oh, say the god Zeus harnessing up his flying horses and winging off to take a front row seat for the Battle of Troy. Because it's supernatural, we cannot attest to it as historical evidence. We can take mythology as evidence of storytelling, but the contents of the mythology itself cannot be validated as historically true because, again, history relies on evidence drawn from the natural, not supernatural world, but the natural world. So mythic figures have to either be correlated to actual historical figures, or they have to be seen simply as mythic figures, products of our big box imaginations, you might say. And there was nothing imaginary about the ruins of Mycenae. What he found was indeed a Bronze Age city, one that perhaps had inspired mythic tales centuries and generations later, but which was all too real and part of that commerce that I mentioned here in the Aegean Sea region. Mycenae, again, on that almost an island, but it's connected to the mainland here by this little finger, the Peloponnese, which is the scene now of Mycenae. So Schliemann had made his way from what he imagined was Troy down here to Mycenae, where he was able to find ruins of a Bronze Age city, one that clearly could have inspired great tales of ancient heroics. History shows that the Bronze Age was a time of great civilizations and great conflicts throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. And here we have an artist's reconception now of what Mycenae looked like at its height from roughly 1600 to 1100 BCE. That is the period that Homer would much later refer to as the Age of Heroes. What we get is a great walled city with a central palace complex occupying the high point of the city. The Greeks will typically do that. That is, they'll build their initial fortifications on high ground and then set about constructing walls for fortification. What does this tell us? It tells us that not only was this a time of great commerce and wealth, but also of war. That is, where riches were accumulated, there were always jealous rivals and would-be conquerors ready to take over. And so these Greek fortifications were meant to guard against that. A fortified city was Mycenae on the Greek mainland during the high point of Greek power in the late Bronze Age, a time later remembered by Homer as the Age of Heroes. And here you see a modern aerial photograph of the same location. So, gosh, yeah, you know why Schliemann was just beside himself with excitement here, as he seemed to strike gold after gold, not only in the California gold rush, but now in the ancient history gold rush of the ancient Mediterranean. Here's what we know historically about Mycenae. Not only that it was at its height during that middle period of the Bronze Age, most centrally from 1450 down to 1100 BCE. Remember, Homer will be writing in the 7th century BCE, so 600 years later. It was a city-state ruled by nobles, perhaps kings, wealthy enough to outfit their corpses with gold death masks. They started the tradition of the Acropolis, the Acropolis. Polis is the city, if you will, acro, rock, city upon a rock, the Acropolis, which becomes part of a Greek landscape now of such city-states with their high point protected ground. It turns out they had their own written script, what is known to historians now as Linear B. The Linear B, the original script, the original writing system, if you will, of the Eastern Mediterranean. And plenty of evidence that, these were trading states that engaged in a lucrative trade of goods throughout the Aegean and up through the Black Sea. Everything from, metals to food crops to fine items of precious minerals and those sorts of things. There's a piece showing the Linear B script with its distinctive linear strokes that created the first written language of the people who we call the Greeks. Peeling away the layers of myth and legend from the Bronze Age reveals a history that inspired the mythic stories of Homer. And again, you can see why. If you're going to set about telling a great story, why not embellish? Why not ground it in an age of heroes with gods and men all competing in a great passion play for wealth and power and ego? Oh my gosh, it's all there. Homer described it as an age of heroes, of great warriors like the Greek Achilles and the Trojan Hector. So he spoke, and pulling out the sharp sword that was slung at the hollow of his side, says Homer, huge and heavy, and gathering himself together, he made his swoop like a high-flown eagle who launches himself out of the murk of the clouds on the flat land to catch away a tender lamb or a shivering hare. So Hector made his swoop, swinging his sharp sword, and Achilles charged, the heart within him loaded with savage fury. In front of his chest, the beautiful, elaborate great shield covered him, and as a star moves among stars in the night's darkening, such was the shining from the pointed spear Achilles was shaking in his right hand, with evil intention toward brilliant Hector. He was eyeing Hector's splendid body to see where it might best give way, but all the rest of the skin was held in the armor, brazen and splendid. Oh, I couldn't help it, folks. I had to read you an excerpt from the Iliad. That's book 22, describing one of the climactic moments when the great Greek demigod warrior Achilles, the son of a Greek goddess, comes mano a mano to face the best that Troy had, the great prince Hector, who will take on Achilles in a fight to the death, one that was also depicted in song and story verse, but also on pottery here. Later Greek pottery likewise depicted what for the Greeks of a later time were very patriotic scenes of Greek heroes and wars fought for the glory of Greece. So by the time Homer's telling these stories, centuries after they were reputed to occur, it's already not only an ancient history of the Greeks, but a heritage and a lineage for what they perceived to be their great traditions. And these images pop up in all kinds of places, including, as you'll see, some of the artifacts that have since been found. A carved warrior figure from Mycenae at the left, that is the Mycenae site, excavated first by Schliemann, and battle scenes from a bronze dagger. I love the Bronze Age dagger there. Also scenes from the Iliad depicted again on the pottery below. And so what these represent are like little clues to a puzzle, clues that historians have tried to piece together to get a more coherent picture, one that, let's say, takes place on, level ground, not so much in the cosmos of Homer's poetry, but more like, in the dirt and dust of excavated sites like Mycenae, to put together something like an actual history that later inspired the poets of Homer's age. So yeah, who were these heroes of Homer anyway? Well, in some ways the story only gets more interesting. I mean, those of you who are afraid that, if we leave the epic poetry, the mythology behind, we're stuck with boring history, not at all. The history itself still seems pretty darn epic, and it's the trail that we need now to follow to understand these heroes of Homer. Heroes like Achilles, you see there depicted on the left in Greek pottery, as well as the great fighter Ajax sitting across from him on the right with their spears, Achilles wearing his great plumed helmet, their various ceremonial battle garb, seemingly, drawing up the battle plan for the great fight to come. Yeah, who were these guys anyway? I mean, are they purely, like in the case of Achilles, his mother is a goddess. Are they just purely characters from the imagination, or more likely, were they sort of hybrid figures drawn half poetry, half history in the great works of Homer? Well, that's what we're going to try to figure out now in the second part of our lecture on the Indo-European migration.